topics that we can have every year, because it seems to me that we have weeds every year. Not quite sure about that. And now that you guys talked about the inversion, now I know what happens in my neighborhood. It's either an inversion or somebody that can't read the label, because there are certain Saturdays I can smell 2,4-D when I step out the door. Significantly. I don't think it's my next door neighbor, but I think there's some. So last to finish this up is Dr. Romano from the diagnostic lab. Dr. Romano is our toxicologist. Dr. Romano is my go-to person when I get a plant question, and it's like, what about this? The book says, but really, is it the right book? And so it's a pleasure that we finally were able to get you to come to Pastures Please and talk about what shouldn't be in our pastures.
Yeah, so first of all, I just want to say we've got him trained pretty well. So, you know, usually Bob's already on the right track when he calls me. So it's not usually a very hard job. But so both of these guys, Dr. Smith and Dr. Witt, have kind of set me up really well here to talk about what I want to talk about, because they already brought up a few things that I always get questions about, which we'll talk about those, and then we'll talk about some other plants that you might have in your pastures. Some you definitely have in your pastures if your pastures are in central Kentucky, because that's just how it goes. But you'd like for them not to be. So we decided to call those plants that shouldn't be in your pasture. If you had one of those, you know, blue moon 100% on your scorecard, you might not have these plants. But as Ray mentioned, none of us have those, unfortunately. So one of the things that they already did a great job of talking about, just because it's green doesn't mean it's grass. And it doesn't mean that it's good grazing. So and I know Krista and the pasture evaluation folks and probably all the extension agents get this too, where somebody thinks, well, look how nice and green it is. So surely I'm in good shape pasture-wise. And not only might there be undesirable forages and bare spots underneath, but there can also be plants that are either toxic or that they just don't want to eat. So how many of you have heard something along the lines of, horses don't eat toxic plants, they're too smart? Anybody ever heard that? I have. I've been told that. I have a horse that, granted he is special, but he will stand in a field of beautiful grass and specifically go for the weeds. Horses are just like people. They eat things if they like the taste. They don't eat things if they don't like the taste. Simple as that. Most toxic plants have a pretty bitter, sour, or otherwise just yucky taste. So a lot of times they don't eat a lot of these plants, with some exceptions that we'll talk about as well. And the thing that's important to know about that is if horses are eating toxic plants, it's generally because there's nothing much else out there to eat. This guy, see if I can get my video to work. Nope. Wrong button. Help. Tech support.
You got it.
I just push buttons until, yeah. I guess probably if you just go on there and, yeah, there we go. So this horse out with a whole lot of green stuff, right? But this that he's digging into here is one of those undesirable plants. So he is eating dock. Can you make it keep playing? Specifically curly dock, thank you. So curly dock is a soluble oxalate plant, and it tastes pretty sour, tart, and they don't usually eat it. But if you look behind this horse, there's not a whole lot else out there, is there? And if you look really close, you can see down here and there that there's some of those cute little yellow flowers that Dr. Witt also talked about. I get a lot of calls about that cute little yellow flower because people think that for some reason it is the most toxic plant they've ever heard of. They read something online, they heard somebody's grandma said something. That's how much they don't like to eat buttercup. They will eat the dock instead of the buttercup. Okay, curly dot, tastes sour, they don't much like it. If you notice, this horse has got some tremors going on here. Later on in the video, it gets worse. That's what soluble oxalates can cause in horses. The oxalate's complex with calcium, so they get really low blood calcium. In Western states where they have plants that are just crazy high in these oxalates, they can actually die from the severe hypocalcemia. This isn't too bad. Again, curly dock is usually around here, is usually an indication that you need to work on your pastures more than anything else. But I love this video because it shows that not only do these guys really need to work on their pasture, this is what bad shape it's in, and he's still not eating the buttercup. And that's because the toxin in buttercup, so there is a toxin in it, but it's what's called a vesicant, which means it causes blisters and burning and pain. And if nothing else, I think we all can appreciate that horses are basically giant weenies when it comes to anything painful. So if they eat something and it causes pain and burning and blisters, they're not going to keep eating it. They will starve before they will consent to eat buttercup. So again, it's a huge problem in pastures because it means there's nothing else out there to eat, and it's just out competing everything. So yes, it's a problem. Yes, you need to do something about it. Dr. Witt gave you some ideas of what specifically to do about it and to make sure you get good forages out there in place of it. But as far as whether it causes problems with toxicosis, it really doesn't. It causes problems with hungry horses. All right, so next we have a couple that are a little bit more interesting from a tox perspective. But again, speaking of plants that are painful, so this is Carolina horse nettle. Dr. Witt mentioned we don't see a ton of it, but we do see some. I love taking pictures of plants as well, just like your friend. So this was actually Crystal Lay and I were out on a farm visit walking a pasture, and I saw this and I was like, wait, I have to take a picture of the plant. So it is toxic, but it is also very spiky. So again, this is something that can be out there, but they're probably not going to eat it. These plants can actually be more of a problem in hay because they do get crushed and dried. All the other stuff is crushed and dried too, right? It's not like a field full of grass where everything is tender and juicy and green. So they can be a little bit more of a problem there. But anybody grow tomatoes? Oh, yes.
Will the horses eat those berries, the fruit?
I am getting to that. You are one slide ahead of me. You are fine. Teacher's pet right here. All right. So yes, so he mentioned the little green berries. So here's another cousin. Both of these are in the nightshade family. So this is Eastern black nightshade. And if anybody grows tomatoes and has paid attention to the little tomato flowers, they look a lot like this. So tomatoes also in the same family. And the berries, so these guys, they're both green when they're immature. Black nightshade has its name because it's got these bright, shiny black berries. And then the Carolina horse nettle, I don't think I have any, but yeah, kind of. Actually, I can't tell. Those might be flowers. You think I'd know it was on my own slide. Those are yellow when they get ripe. And so the berries actually can be a problem, definitely with the nightshade. I'm not sure with the horse nettle just because they have berries, but they're still surrounded and those spikes are on the leaves. As well. I learned that the first time I went to go move one to get a better picture. It was like, ooh, those they got spikes on the leaves too, not just the stems. So, but I know they can be a problem in cattle because I have found Carolina horse nettle berries in rumen contents of cattle. So, but again, they're tougher. They got tougher hide, tougher lips. So yeah, so both of these things, they contain very similar compounds. They're called tropane alkaloids. What they cause, as almost everything else does in horses, is colic and GI upset. If you're ever not sure what something causes in horses, it's probably colic and GI upset. Maybe some other things too, but definitely colic. And then depending on what particular combination of alkaloids, they can cause either increased gut motility where you get diarrhea, and it can be pretty watery diarrhea, or they can get ileus and impaction because things don't move along well enough. So kind of opposite sides of the coin there. Again, it depends on the plant part and the stage of maturity and what the whole bag of alkaloids is that's in there. All right, we also talked a little bit about poison hemlock. So how many pastures do you guys think have poison hemlock? I'm gonna give you a hint, it's all of them. They do, I promise. I found some, the picture didn't turn out very well, but I actually found some in my flower bed of all places. There's none anywhere around it. It comes from nowhere, and it does very well in central Kentucky. We usually get at least 2 cuttings a year, and they hardly ever eat it because if you've never been very close to it, if you see a plant and if you keep an eye out for them, you'll start to see them almost anywhere there's parks or any kind of grassy wooded-ish areas. You'll see these plants that look a lot like carrot. So especially the babies, the immature plants, the tops are very similar to carrot. They have purple on the stems, which is harder to see when they're young like that. But when they get bigger, you can really start to see these purple splotches all over the stem. And then again, the flowers kind of look like carrot or Queen Anne's lace. They're again, all in the same family. So they look kind of similar. The more mature they are, the more toxic they are, but they also taste really bad. And they smell, and I am not kidding, they smell just like mouse pee. Probably most horse people have had to deal with mice and rodents getting into the feed room or the tack room or maybe both and eating not only the feed but the saddle soap and sometimes your blankets, and it stinks when that happens. And these plants, when they get mature, I mean, you don't even have to be that close. You can smell the musty, nasty smell. The only time that I have seen, even in cattle, that they will eat a significant amount of poison hemlock is when animals have been dry lotted, and then they break through a fence and they just go, yay, something green. And they don't even pause long enough to taste what it is. They just mow it down, eat a lot, at once, and they can have problems then. So it's not usually a problem fresh for that reason. So the baby plants don't taste too bad, but they're also not very toxic. The big plant, and these things can get, taller than me and then some, but they're pretty nasty. So when we see problems with hemlock, again, it's almost always in hay because they lose that bitter taste, but they don't lose any of the toxic potential. So again, something, keep an eye out for it, get rid of it. And the bottom line with a lot of these is if they have enough good forage to eat, whether that's pasture or whether that's good hay, they don't eat these things that taste bad. All right, so milkweeds, everybody knows about the butterfly milkweed, the monarch butterfly. I found this guy hanging out, monarch caterpillar, on some milkweed at a little park garden. 2 flavors of milkweed. So there's broadleaf and there's world leaf. They can be cardiotoxic or neurotoxic. So it just depends on the specific one. Again, even with the cardiotoxic ones, because they're horses and their GI tracts are kind of their Achilles heel, what we usually see with cardiotoxic milkweeds is going to be GI upset, colic. You can get some arrhythmias and other heart issues if they eat enough of it. But again, they're horses, so those GI problems are going to predominate. The world leaf ones, thankfully, are more common out west. They get all the nasty plants out there, and they can cause some really severe neurologic signs and pretty acute death with relatively small amounts. So that's one to be thankful that we don't have here. Again, you'll notice a recurring theme, more of a problem in hay, because for the same reason, part of why they don't taste great with the milkweeds is that milky sap, which is where they get their name. That kind of dries out when they're crushed in hay. And again, they can't sort through and get rid of them. The broadleaf, the leaves are big enough that they can sort those a little better, but those narrow leaf milkweeds, so again, if hay from somewhere that might have them, because thankfully they're not too common around here. But we have butterfly milkweed and common milkweed are the two that we'll see quite a bit around here. And I had a great picture illustrating if they have enough else to eat, they probably won't eat this. Where my friend that actually boards my horse right now, there's one little milkweed plant by itself, and you can kind of see where they've grazed everywhere else, and then they went, no, we don't want that. And then off they go to graze something that tastes a lot better. All right, so you guys also mentioned Johnson grass and sorghum Sudan, Sudan grass. Again, same family, same problems. Anybody that raises cattle is also probably really familiar with the problems that they can cause. It can be a really good forage, but it can also cause problems. I feel like in Kentucky, it's more just viewed as a weed, period, full stop. I used to practice in Texas, and a lot of the cattle farmers, that's mostly what they graze, and they were just pretty good about managing when there was adverse weather so that they might run into problems with cyanide. So cyanide and nitrates are the two big things that you can have with Johnson grass and sorghum in cattle. Totally different in horses. So that's something that with a lot of toxic plants, the signs and symptoms are going to depend on the species of animal, and especially ruminants versus monogastrics, because ruminants have that whole ecosystem inside in the rumens. So some things are more toxic, some things are less. Some things are just different. So that's the case with Johnson grass. So they do have to graze it for quite a while. So like Ray mentioned, if there's a little bit here and there in the pasture, that's not a huge deal. If they eat a lot for a long time, what horses develop is neurologic problems in the back end. So they can get wobbly behind, weak behind, and then they also have trouble voiding their bladder all the way, and particularly in mares because of how the bladder is shaped and kind of sits down under that pelvic brim. So like you see here, this is the south end of a mare, and there's her vulva, and there's all this stuff that's just sediment and urinary yuck that can't quite get voided all the way out. And so they develop this cystitis, so inflammation, and then they can get urinary tract infections because everything is so angry. They are also will develop incontinence. And so on the one hand, they're dribbling kind of all the time, but they also, on the other hand, can't completely empty out their bladder. So you have the stuff that sticks around in the bladder, and then you have this, they can get really bad urine scalding on their hind end, on their hocks, because of that constant dribbling. So the good news is, again, this takes quite a bit over a little bit of time. So it's not something that, oh my gosh, they ate a bite of Johnson grass, but you definitely don't want to let it take over. And if you catch it early and eliminate the source, it actually is pretty reversible. This mare is in pretty bad shape at this point, but a lot of times it'll resolve if you remove the source. All right, on to trees. So probably most of you have heard, at least in passing, about red maple poisoning. Red maple is bad for horses, at least to some point. Yes? Everybody with me? Okay. How many of you are aware that it's not just red maple? Yay, we got 1, 2, 3. Okay, a few of you. All right, so one of the things that is a little bit complicated, and my theories are that there are a few reasons for this. So with red maple, with sugar maple, with silver maple, red maple hybrids, they probably all cause the same thing. What happens is these leaves, and it is wilted leaves, so this almost always happens after a storm, after one horrible case involving an entire herd of Belgians was from a tree trimming company that worked for the power company, and they came along, and these, they weren't in the pasture, they were outside of it. But when these folks trimmed the trees, the branches fell into the pasture. This is one that even if they have plenty of other good forage, horses are also a little bit like puppies. They can be curious. They'll come investigate new things. They'll strip the leaves off of a down branch that has fallen in their pasture. What happens is that there are tannins in the leaves. You guys have heard about oak, and especially oak problems in cattle. It's a very similar thing. So it's these gallotannins. What happens with the maples is that bacteria in the horse's hindgut. So this happens in equines. So it's been reported in horses and donkeys, and I believe zebras, and then alpacas, because alpacas are weird. So that was one case report, so I don't really have any further explanation of what happens in alpacas, but the work that's been done in horses shows that it takes extract from the wilted leaves, and then they take GI contents and incubate them together. So it's the same idea of what happens in cattle is the ruminal microbes break down the tannins from the oak. Well, this happens in the hindgut with maple and horses, and it produces these oxidant compounds, and horse red blood cells are really sensitive to oxidants, and so the red blood cells end up getting damaged, and then they break apart, they hemolyze. So these horses can get really, really anemic. They can have trouble breathing, look like they're having trouble breathing. What's actually happening is that oxygen is not being carried because they don't have intact red blood cells to carry the oxygen around. So their heart is fine, their lungs are fine, but they don't have the transport for the oxygen. So they'll kind of stand there. They might look like they're huffing and puffing. Their heart rates will go up because they're just really trying to circulate oxygen around. But again, one of the most common things that we see as far as looking at sick horses is colic. Because if anything goes wrong with a horse, its gut hurts. Again, things not getting enough blood supply tend to make organs and body systems upset. And so in the horse, it's the GI tract. So that can be a thing that is seen in these animals. What's interesting is that all the reported cases have been with red maple, so Acer rubrum, but the lab experiments incubating the equine red blood cells, the equine GI contents, and the leaves, it's done the same thing with those other species that I mentioned as well. So it definitely seems like red maple hybrids, and then possibly other species of maple as well. So our recommendation is just any kind of acer species. It's just safest to not take a chance on it and having it around horses. And so this is actually stomach contents from a case that we got in over at the diagnostic lab that shows you just really doesn't take very much. This horse ended up dying from it and had about a handful of leaves in his stomach. Okay, so black locus is another tree that can cause some problems. This is strictly a GI irritant, specifically a GI irritant, I should say. So that's already what it causes in other species besides horses. So in horses, it'll be a problem. They can get really severe diarrhea. They can get really dehydrated very quickly. A lot of what we see with these is horses stripping the bark off the trees if they're either just bored, or sometimes when they're tied to the trees, they don't have anything else to do, so they'll just pick off the bark, or the leaves can also be a problem. And one of the things, so you'll see these seed pods, another very similar related tree is honey locust, which is not toxic, but can cause GI problems because they'll eat those seed pods that can cause obstructions. So there's all kinds of things that can be problematic in horses that are not necessarily toxic because they're horses and they find ways to get into trouble. All right. How about wild cherry? Who's heard about wild cherry? Oh my gosh, wild cherry in my horse pastures. Horse is gonna die. They're all gonna die. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. They're not gonna die. Calm down. It was a joke. So the problem with wild cherry, it is a problem. But the problem with wild cherry is that it is the, I'm not going to mess this up this time. So again, in ruminants, it can cause the problem with the cyanide. Ruminants are really sensitive because of those gut microbes. Horses don't have the same ones. Monogastrics don't have the problem with the cyanogenic compounds like ruminants do. However, wild cherry trees are home to this guy. Anybody recognize him? Yeah, Eastern tent caterpillar. So famous culprit of mare reproductive loss syndrome. So definitely not a thing that you want to encourage around your broodmare pastures. But it's not because the trees are toxic. It's because they host these caterpillars, which are actually really interesting. And there's some thought that the little hairs on the caterpillars migrate and can cause some issues with taking bacteria along with them. That hasn't been fully fleshed out yet, but there are some examples of other fuzzy hairy caterpillars that do similar things. So again, not toxic plant related, but I just thought that was really cool. And this one. So this should not be in anyone's horse pasture. Hopefully it is not. Occasionally we see problems, again, with cattle, poor cattle. People just, because they are tougher than horses, and people just think you can put them anywhere and they can eat anything and they will be fine and never die because they're cattle. And they'll turn them out onto old homesteads full of taxes because it used to be somebody's living place, and they had a house and they had shrubs. We thankfully don't see that so much with horses, but what we do see is almost any building in central Kentucky has this shrub outside it somewhere. When I first started my tax residency, I would get really excited and be like, "Ooh, there's a taxus bush," and I would take a picture of it. And about a week in, I was like, I mean, if I ever need one, I can just walk to any parking lot and it's probably got a border of taxus hedge around it. This one is actually at Phasig Tipton. which is funny enough, but I did my internship at Nettle, and there's all around the front, if you've ever been there or parked there, there's a nice taxus hedge around there too. Not in the back where the barns are, thank goodness. But the problem is that when people do landscaping, they trim trees. These guys are evergreen. They make these pretty little red berries. And people will either think, again, evergreen, so dead of winter, they'll go, oh, you know what? I bet those horses would really appreciate something green to eat. And they chuck them over the fence. Or they're just really lazy and they think, I could bag it up and take it to the road and get it hauled off. Or I could just chuck it over the fence. And they chuck it over the fence and a whole bunch of animals die. So this particular plant is on here because it's more in the nature of a public service announcement to let your friends and neighbors know, please do not throw anything over the fence to the animals, horses or cattle, because it does not take very much and it is very deadly very quickly. So talked a little bit about how it depends how much they eat of a lot of things. You know, maybe they're a little toxic, but like with the Johnson grass, they have to eat quite a bit. Taxus is not like that. Taxus, one bite and you're done. So if you have any around your house, which there's a good chance you do if you live anywhere around here, don't feed the clippings to animals. And again, talking to your neighbors, because we see that a lot where it's usually someone that's really thinking they don't know anything about livestock and it just would never occur to them that this plant that they have around their house for decoration could possibly be toxic. Oh, there's my I got ahead of myself. So there's the trimmings, and then someone will scoop them up and pitch them over. All right, that is all I have because I can talk all day about poisonous plants, but I will stop there and answer any questions. That's my contact information. Email is by far the best because a lot of times I can't get to the phone, but I can always eventually answer an email. So make sure to write that down if you have any questions in the future or that you think of when you get home, anything like that. You are always welcome to